All right, everyone. Welcome to the psychology lecture titled, What is Psychology? So this is an introductory lecture. This is going to be focused on some very broad introductory principles and topics in the field of psychology. So if you watched the first lecture, we talked about some psychology myths. We had that uh, true or false psychology quiz, and they all ended up being false because they were all psychology myths that you may have heard or been exposed to in some form. Now, again, I want to stress that you shouldn't feel stupid if you said true to any of those. There's a very good reason why you might think any number of those is true. There is what you might call a kernel of a truth to a lot of those different questions that I asked. But we're going to talk about how we separate myth from fact, how we separate those myths that we talked about from reality. And we're going to talk about the scientific method, and we're going to talk specifically about the scientific method and how it applies to psychology. There are a lot of different questions that we ask in the field of psychology, but the one uniting feature is that all psychologists, if they're worth their salt, use the scientific method. And we're going to talk about different ways that the scientific method is used. We're going to talk about what the scientific method is. We're going to talk about sort of how it came to be used within the psychological sciences. So, moving on. First, I want to talk about two main types of research in the field of psychology. We're going to talk about basic and applied. Basic research is what's usually done in a university setting. This is what's done in those basement laboratories by people in lab coats. This is, in its purest form, simply knowledge gathering. So, an example of this would be a basic understanding of spoken language. When I was a graduate student, I worked in a spoken language laboratory, and it was a basic research laboratory. We were trying to understand fundamental processes of spoken language. How does the human mind comprehend spoken language? How does the human mind produce spoken language? We're trying to get a fundamental understanding of how the human mind is able to do those things. So, contrast basic research with what we call applied research. Applied research is answering a specific question. So, we use the findings from basic research to help answer applied questions, applied research. This is usually done in the private sector. And again, they're trying to answer specific questions. So, an example of this might be, how can we make our speech recognition software better at natural discourse? So, this might be a question that Google engineers are asking. I'm sure you've all played around with the speech to text. Well, this would be something that those software engineers would be interested in. Of course, I think Apple has one too. There's many different forms out there. I'm most familiar with the Android version. So, engineers that are trying to make a piece of software better understand human speech will definitely be using the basic research that people like myself have helped create to understand how those processes work in the first place. How we as humans are able to search through the thousands and thousands and thousands of words that we know and pick out the right one. And we do that in an incredibly fast and relatively accurate way. So, basic and applied research. Let's get to know them a little bit more. I've got a list of questions on the screen here. We're going to go through these one by one. Most of these questions would easily fall into the basic category or the applied category. And we'll start with the one at the top. How does motivation affect behavior? So this would be an example of basic research. We're not asking a specific question. We're trying to understand the fundamental relationship between motivation and behavior. How does motivation affect behavior? How can we increase motivation to produce a certain behavior? How can we decrease motivation to produce less of a certain behavior? Second one there, what practice regimens should I engage in to score more goals? This would be an example of applied research. This is actually a question that gets asked quite a bit in sports psychology. How do I practice in a specific way to produce this one specific result, which is more scoring proficiency? How do we comprehend spoken words? This is an example of basic research. We're not asking a very specific question. That's kind of a broad, open-ended. It's not trying to get a specific result. It's trying to understand a process. How do we best motivate our employees to sell more blank? That's an example of applied research. This would be a question that a private company would probably be asking its efficiency department. What technique reduces neck pressure the most when portaging a canoe? This would be an example of applied research. So whoever is asking this question, perhaps a canoe company, is trying to figure out ways that are most ergonomic to portage a canoe on someone's back. And the last question there at the bottom, how does the visual system in the brain work? Very open-ended, very broad, definitely an example of basic research. We're just trying to understand how a complex system works. We're not trying to get a specific result. We're not trying to increase a certain outcome. We're not trying to increase or decrease a specific dependent variable. We're just trying to understand how something that is very complicated works. So basic and applied research, this is not a distinction that is cut and dry. Sometimes there are overlap between these two types of research, but in a general sense, research can kind of fall into these two categories. What most people think of when they think of research is basic research. They want to understand something about human behavior. What is love? How do we make ourselves more intelligent? What is intelligence? Those are basic research questions. Applied research, much more specific. So I want to go on to a little bit more about the difference between basic and applied research. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of basic research. Basic research gets a bad rap sometimes. And this is because the uses for basic research are not always immediately apparent. So a great example of this was Senator Proxmire. So Senator Proxmire was a US Senator, and he started giving out the Golden Fleece Awards. So these were awards that he made a big show of, and he presented these awards in Congress and to much publicity. And what these awards were in his mind, they were the biggest waste of government funding that had happened that year. So he was trying to draw attention to wasteful government spending. And so he shined a light on some of these research grants that were given out by the United States government by institutions like the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, or the FDA, or the Department of Agriculture. And he thought that they were just wasting money, throwing all this money at researchers who were looking at really silly things that were just not worth anyone's time. So he developed the Golden Fleece Awards. And one of the famous examples of this was he gave the Golden Fleece Award to a Dr. Knipling. Dr. Knipling received $250,000 to study the mating habits of screwworms. If that doesn't get a chuckle out of you, I don't know what will. So Senator Proxmire is on Congress floor. He's making a big deal about Dr. Knipling receiving $250,000 to study the mating habits of screwworms. That's basic research. And yeah, it's a little bit silly on the surface of it, but there has to have been a good reason for this $250,000 to be spent, right? Let's look a little bit deeper. So the basic research that Dr. Knipling created with this $250,000 allowed us to introduce preventative mating techniques to the screwworm population. And he did this by introducing sterile males into the screwworm population. So these sterile males attempted to mate and they were unable to produce offspring. Turns out, by doing this, this saved the United States cattle industry about $20 billion a year. And that's every year. So that $250,000 eventually led to a $20 billion annual savings. So obviously, this was a wonderful investment that paid itself off many, 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 many times over. And this actually reduced the price of beef in the United States by 5%. So Senator Proxmire got a little bit of egg on his face, and this really highlights the fact that basic research, the use of it, it's not always immediate, it's not always apparent, but that doesn't mean that it's useless. There definitely can be some huge, huge advances by putting a little bit of time and effort and resources into basic research. All right, so here's a couple quotes that I want to share with you guys, again, on the difference between basic and applied research. The first one is from Keith Stanovich. It is probably a mistake to view the basic versus applied distinction solely in terms of whether a study has practical applications, because this difference often simply boils down to a matter of time. Applied findings are of use immediately. However, there is nothing so practical as a general and accurate theory. So bringing that back to the golden fleece example, it was very useful to have a general understanding of the mating habits of screwworms. Then we could use that basic research to look at applied research ways of stopping that mating cycle from happening. George Smoot says that people cannot foresee the future well enough to predict what's going to develop from basic research. If we only did applied research, we would still be making better spears. So think back to our caveman days when the best, most advanced technology we had at the time was a spear. If we were still only doing applied research, we would simply be trying to improve the spear. And then Don Mackay, who's a researcher that I worked with a number of years ago, sort of famous memory researcher. His quote here is, "What's the point of a child?" And the point that he's making here is that you don't know what a child can grow up to be. It could be the person that grows up to cure cancer. It could be the person that grows up to do some crazy, wonderful things for society. Basic research is kind of like that. You don't know most of the time where basic research is going to lead to, but that doesn't mean that it's useless. Both basic and applied research are valuable in psychology. So we're going to talk about how modern psychology came to be what it is today. We're going to start a little bit before Freud, but Freud was really the first, for lack of a better term, like the first rock star in psychology. It's a very, very well-known name. I'm sure you all have heard the name Sigmund Freud before, for better or for worse. And then we're going to follow that all the way to Daniel Kahneman, who is maybe perhaps the modern day rock star in psychology. He's won a number of Nobel Awards, that number being one. And also, I want to stress that psychology is still relatively a young science. It's only been around for just about 100 years. And that's pretty young as far as sciences go. We're still trying to nail down what the big questions in psychology are. We've kind of nailed down the methodology, but the big questions are still a little bit up in the air. So we'll get to these different points shortly. All right, before we jump into that, I'm going to take a quick drink of water, and we're going to move all the way back in time in our fancy time machine here to 300 BCE. and we're going to talk about Plato. Plato was a philosopher back in ancient Greece, and he was interested in how we gather knowledge. He was interested in how we know things. How do we separate myth from fact? And Plato's a smart guy. He does a lot of thinking, and he comes up with this idea of the theory of forms. So the theory of forms is this idea that knowledge, pure, true facts, come from thinking about pure forms. Okay, so what is a pure form? So there exists a pure form of everything that you can encounter in the quote unquote real world. So let's say you're interested in cats and you want to study cats, you want to learn about them. So there exists in the ether an ideal perfect cat. And that cat is what you are actually trying to study. Every single cat that you encounter in real life is an imperfect representation of that pure, ideal, perfect cat. So if you're interested in cat mating habits, you would want to think of and try to study in your mind that pure form, ideal, perfect cat. If you were to go out on the street and catch a feral cat, that cat would not be a good representation of cats in general. It would be imperfect in some way. Maybe it has rabies, or it's missing an eye, or it's got mange, or lived a rough life on the street. Or perhaps you have a domesticated cat, so you want to study that cat. Well, that cat doesn't represent every cat because it has lived a different life than every cat has. It's maybe been an indoor cat its whole life. Maybe it has stress issues, it's bored or something. I don't really know. But that is sort of the theory of forms in a nutshell. If we want to learn something about the world, we have to sit and think about that ideal, perfect version of whatever it is that we're interested in. This started the foundation of the approach of what we call rationalism. The basics behind rationalism is that you can't trust what's in front of you. You have to think about, in this pure sort of realm, what it is that you want to study. Plato also used what's called the allegory of the cave. And if you've taken a philosophy class, you might be familiar with this. The allegory of the cave. We represent, or are represented by, this little prisoner guy here. And let's say we're in this cave and we're chained to somewhere in that cave. We can't escape. In fact, all we can do is look at this wall. We're looking at the wall of the cave. And above us and behind us, there is a source of light. And that source of light, whether it's a torch or a flashlight or whatever, is shining onto an object. And that object's shadow is getting cast onto the wall, again, the wall that we can look at, the only thing we can see in the whole cave. We are like this prisoner trapped in this cave. That's how we exist in the world. If we want to learn about cats, we want to think about this pure ideal cat right here. But the only thing that we can see directly is that shadowy image of a cat projected onto this wall. And let's say this is a fire, it's a torch or a campfire or something. So, if you've ever seen a campfire, the light kind of moves around, it waves in the wind. It's sort of, if you've ever seen, like a shadow from a fire, it's all kind of wobbly and moving around and it's kind of like shaking a little. It's not a great representation of what this object would actually look like. Well, that's the best we can do in this present world. This shadow would represent that imperfect cat that we come across in our daily life, whether that's that domesticated one or the one that lives on the street. So that shadow is not going to be a very good representation of what we actually want to study, which is this object right here with the light. So that's the allegory of the cave. Again, Plato's just kind of stressing you can't trust your senses. You can't trust what you're looking at. You can't trust what you're hearing. You can't trust your physical senses. What you actually want to be studying is this thing that you can't directly observe. So Plato's really stressing rationalism. He's really stressing the power of the mind and what we would call theory in today's psychological terms. Contrast Plato with Aristotle. And again, if you've taken a philosophy class, you might be a little more familiar with this. Aristotle said the exact opposite. Knowledge is gained through direct observation. And Aristotle actually was a proponent of what we might call radical empiricism. So again, Aristotle's saying the exact opposite. If we want to learn about the world, we have to go out and sense that world. We have to look at cats. We have to weigh cats. We have to touch cats. We have to smell cats. We have to do a whole bunch of measurements and tests on cats. We have to trust our senses because that's the only way we get information about the world around us. But Aristotle wasn't a complete idiot. He knew that sometimes our sensory observations can be skewed, sometimes they can be inaccurate. So we have to apply theories, we have to apply reason to these observations. And this is what became known as empiricism. So, where we have Plato who's saying, no, you can't trust your senses, you have to sit and think about these pure forms of things. Aristotle is saying, no, you have to trust your senses. That's the only way you can get direct observations of the world. So, we have rationalism and empiricism. And both of these schools of thought exist today in psychology in some form. We have empiricism, where you're encouraged to examine nature directly, and we have rationalism, where you are encouraged to rely on rational thinking. And these really exist today in the scientific method as theory and data. Data would be these direct observations using our senses, and theory would be this rational thinking that guides our sensory observations, that guides those measurements. So instead of thinking of these as opposites, they're kind of used hand in hand. So empiricism, how can rational thought aid our observations? Well, imagine the scenario where you simply walk out into the woods. Let's say you're a scientist interested in studying trees. And you simply walk out into the woods with a notepad and a pencil, and you just start taking random observations. Maybe you measure the height of a tree here, the circumference of a tree here, the color of a specific piece of bark here, and so on and so forth. And you come back at the end of the day and you've got all these random observations and you try to make sense of them and they just don't really make sense. That would be an extreme form of radical empiricism. You need some sort of theory. You need some sort of way to guide those observations. If you have a theory, say that you think birch trees are taller and thicker than aspen trees, you go out there and you measure the height and thickness of every single aspen tree you come across and every single birch tree you come across. That would be a great way to add a little bit of sense to your observations. And same with rationalism. If you have complete theory with no data, you're really just engaging in a logical thought experiment. If you're sitting at home in the laboratory and you think to yourself, yes, birch trees are bigger than aspen trees, but you don't go and bother collecting any data on that theory, then that theory is kind of useless. It's really just someone's opinion at that point. It might be a very well thought out, very logical, very rational opinion. But if you don't have any empirical evidence to support it, then it's not all that useful in a scientific sense. So again, just kind of elaborating on this point here, rationalism and empiricism, they exist today in the form of theory and data. What is theory without data? Well, it's unsubstantiated claims, it's opinions. What is data without theory? It's meaningless information. All those random observations you made walking through the woods with your notepad, you have to have some sort of plan to organize and digest that information. So specifically for psychology, which is a very broad field, we have many different ways to gather data, and we have many different ways to generate new theories on how to use that data. And we're going to start with Wilhelm Wundt. Back in 1879 at the University of Leipzig in Germany, Wilhelm Wundt is credited with starting the very first psychology laboratory. And he studied very low-level consciousness, basically reaction times. He was very interested in the speed that our mind worked. So Wilhelm Wundt, he would do these experiments where he would present a noise to a participant in the laboratory, and then he would measure their reaction times, how fast they could respond, in a couple different ways. So if you're just sitting there at a desk with a button and you hear a noise, he might ask you to push that button as soon as you hear that noise. And then he would measure the time it took from that noise to start until the time you push that button. So he's got very accurate measurements, very accurate machines that make these measurements. He can measure like millisecond reaction times. And then he would do other experiments where you'd hear the noise and he would expect you to say something out loud. Yes, I heard it, or heard. And then he had machines that could measure how fast it took you to make that verbal response. So if you take those two experiments and you look at the difference between the time it takes you to hit a button and the time it takes you to make a verbal response, which would be considered like a conscious awareness of that noise, you can, in a way, measure the time it takes to be consciously aware of something. The time difference between simply hitting a button and the time difference between saying something out loud can tell us a lot about how fast that process is in our minds. So that was kind of the very first step towards psychological process measuring. Moving forward a few decades, we have Edward Titchener. So Titchener founded a school of thought called structuralism. And this is one half of the very first feud in psychology. You're not a real science until you have your very first feud. And this was that for psychology. Edward Titchener believed in this idea of structuralism. What he wanted to do is look at the components of a mental function. This is the idea of studying a car by its disconnected pieces. So think about you're interested in studying cars. So you take a car apart and you look at the pieces individually. You maybe look at the tires, you look at the steering wheel, you look at the windshield, you look at the engine, and you try to figure out what's going on with this car just by looking at the individual pieces of it. So he tried to do this with mental functions. So if he was interested in something like how we identify objects, he might put you in a room and show you, let's say, a rose. And he would ask you to describe what is going on in your mind while you look at that rose. And in order to do these experiments, he had to have very highly trained participants. So he didn't just pull people off the street. He didn't just pull people out of a general psychology classroom. He had to work with the same participant for potentially years to get them to be a highly trained participant so that they could accurately describe what's going on in their mind while they're looking at this rose or whatever it might be. And the whole idea behind this, again, is to try to understand this process of, let's say, visual recognition by looking at the individual processes that make up visual recognition. Now, as I've alluded to here before, this process relied very heavily on introspection. And introspection is kind of a nasty word in psychology today. It's something that is not very well regarded. If you're using introspection, it typically means that your results are going to be very subjective and very biased. So for example, let's say we have two different participants. You sit them down in that room, you show them the picture of that rose, and you ask them to describe what's going on. Well, you might have one participant talk at length about how the color red makes them angry. You might have another participant talk at length about how roses are just their favorite flower because it reminds them of their wife or something like that. So you can get very, very different results, and they're very, very susceptible to subjectiveness or to subjective bias. So that's Edward Titchener, that's structuralism, trying to understand a mental function by looking at its components. Then the other side of this feud is William James and functionalism. William James decided that that's not right. Titchener's wrong. The best way to study a psychological concept is to look at its function. What is the purpose of a mental function? So, going to that car metaphor, what is the purpose of a car? What does it do? It transports us, it gets us from point A to point B. If you want to learn about cars, that's where you need to focus. So, taking this metaphor into the psychological realm, let's say you're interested in emotions. Maybe you're interested in love or you're interested in anger. Okay, so when someone experiences anger, what does that make them do? What do they do when they respond to that emotion of anger? Do they lash out violently? Do they verbally assault people? Do they bury that emotion? What happens with their sympathetic system? Do they have an elevated heart rate, respiratory rate? What happens when they experience anger? So William James, Edward Titchener, very first feud in psychology. William James is taking more of a holistic approach. Let's look at what happens, sort of the outcomes. Edward Titchener is like, no, 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 no. Let's break it down. Let's pull it apart piece by piece, and let's just see what the individual components are. You can kind of maybe a little bit see that dichotomy, that non-existent dichotomy between theory and data here in these two approaches. So, structuralism, functionalism. Structuralism, attempt to break down mental processes, study individual components of thought and consciousness. That is Edward Titchener. Functionalism is William James, attempt to study mental processes as a whole, study the outcome of a mental process. Let's move on to Sigmund Freud. We skipped a few years once again, and we come to, like I said before, for better or for worse, the very first rock star of psychology. And Sigmund Freud brought with him this school of thought called psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is focused on unconscious motivations for behaviors. And this approach focuses extremely on two motivations: sex and aggression. If you asked Freud, what is a human, it would probably come down to these two things: sex and aggression. Just an unbelievable focus on these two things. And there's a lot of theory out there that Freud produced. A lot of it is junk. A lot of it is absolute junk. He is a product of his times. A lot of his theories are very sexist. There's absolutely no sugarcoating that. There was a lot of sexism in psychoanalysis back in the 30s. And that being said, there's a lot that you can simply outright dismiss from Sigmund Freud. But there is some good that Sigmund Freud produced. So starting with the bad, the example I have on the screen there is penis envy. Like I said, huge focus on sex. So penis envy is this idea that women, again, I want to stress this is a pretty sexist theory here, back from Sigmund Freud's time. So the idea that women are inherently inferior to men because they are inherently envious of what men have between their legs and women do not. Now, there's some pretty big logical leaps that need to be made for how that lack of male anatomy somehow leads to a feeling of inferiority. But it unfortunately was a very popular idea at the time, and it was sort of used as a way to justify women's place in society. Nowadays, it's laughable. It's something that we bring up in general psychology classes to kind of point out the absurdity of Sigmund Freud in a lot of ways. But I do want to balance that out with some of the good that Sigmund Freud produced. Sigmund Freud was maybe not the first, but he was the first person that was listened to who made a connection between stress and mental illness. He was one of the first to publicly say, and to have the sort of professional chops to support it, that stress can cause mental illness. Up until this time, it was thought that mental illness is something you were born with. You were either born destined for the loony bin, or you were born healthy, mentally healthy. Well, Freud was one of the first to say that no, that's not true. Anyone can develop mental illness if they are exposed to enough stress. So again, Freud was one of the first to say that, which was surprisingly forward thinking for the time. And very surprising thinking coming from a man who invented something called penis envy. All right. Freud's theory of personality. This is an idea that has kind of stuck around. And again, it's not really a theory that's all that useful in as far as like empirical testing and experimentation goes. But it's a useful theory just from sort of a historical perspective. So the theory of personality that Freud gave us is that personality can be split up into three main components: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is based on this pleasure principle. The id wants immediate gratification, and it wants it now, and it wants it all day long. The id is completely unconscious, and this is almost completely motivated by Freud's idea of sex and aggression. The id is constantly seeking sex, constantly seeking aggression, constantly seeking some sort of pleasurable experience for that person. When we're very young, we're almost completely ruled by the id, that constant pleasure seeking. The ego develops a little bit later, a couple of years after birth, and the ego is focused on the reality principle. The ego is semi-conscious. The ego is sort of the steering wheel. If the id is the gas pedal, the ego is the steering wheel. So the ego would say something like, if the id is going, I want it now, I want it now, 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 the ego would say, whoa, 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 step back, id. We got to do a little bit of work, a little bit of planning to get that thing that you want right now. The superego is something that develops in adolescence, according to Freud's theory, and the superego deals with morals. The superego is completely conscious. We have complete control over our morals. So the superego is the one that steps back even further and says, is it right to have it? Yes, I realize, id, that you want it right now. Ego, I realize that you can obtain it if we do X, Y, Z. But the superego says, should we have it in the first place? This is the basics of Freud's theory of personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. I'm not terribly concerned that you know too much about this theory of personality. It's kind of an older idea, but know the basics of the id, the ego, and the superego, from a historical perspective at least. Freud was also a pioneer in what we call stage development theories. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because a lot of it is pretty silly and it's so outdated. But again, Freud was a pioneer in many ways, and this was one of those ways. Stage development theories are very common in developmental psychology. And this is the idea that as we develop, as we grow up, we go through several stages. And depending on what happens in those stages, that will affect our personality in one way or another for essentially the rest of our lives. But Freud being Freud, of course, those stages focus on sex. They focus on sexual pleasure. So if you've ever heard the term someone is kind of anal, meaning that they're kind of uptight, that they're kind of a super type A person, micromanager, something like that, that comes from Freud's stages of development, specifically what he called the anal stage of development. So, again, in this stage development theory, you have a couple different outcomes. And for the anal stage of development in Freud's idea, you have what one of those outcomes is an anal retentive personality. Which, again, this is just so bizarre to even be talking about. But the idea, according to Freud, is that if a child in that early stage of development spends a lot of time holding in their poop, withholding feces, that will lead to an anal retentive personality, an anal personality. Like, it's just so silly. On the surface of it, I don't know how this gained any traction. But that's all I'm going to say about Freud's stages of development. I just want you to remember that he was one of the first to come up with this stage development theory. And we're going to talk quite a bit more about stage developments when we get to the development chapter. All right, so that's Freud. Again, for better or for worse, a lot of worse, maybe a little bit of better. But starting in about the 1920s with John Watson, we're starting to see a shift in psychology. So Freud was criticized at the time. He was beloved. He was listened to. His theories held a lot of weight, but he was also criticized a lot. And he was criticized by people that eventually founded the schools of behaviorism. So behaviorists despised introspection, looking at you, Edward Titchener, and they despised anything not directly observable, which in this realm of psychology means the unconscious. We can't directly observe the unconscious. So these behaviorists wanted to make psychology focused on things that we can observe, and they wanted to focus it on observable behavior. So they kind of created this idea of the black box of the mind. And the idea behind this is that the mind is a black box. We cannot directly observe it. We can't crack open someone's skull and look at what's going on in there. That won't give us the answers we're looking for. So for the time being, we are going to ignore the black box. We're going to ignore what goes on in the black box. There may be a time in the future when we have the technology to study the processing that goes on in that black box. But for now, all we can do is study what goes into the black box and what comes out of the black box. This is a very basic way to say that in behaviorist idea of observable behavior, we're going to be looking at stimulus and response. Stimulus is what you present to that black box. Response is what comes out of that black box. And this really started psychology down the path of a respectable science. Freud was entertaining, he was popular, he wrote a lot of books that were in the mainstream media. He wrote a lot of books that were very popular, but they weren't really scientific at all. Looking at you, Penis Envy. So behaviorism was really an attempt to make psychology a respectable science. Again, by focusing on what we can observe, observable behavior. So let's talk about behaviorism. One of the first behaviorists, John Watson. And John Watson believed that nurture is the sole cause of personality, talking about nature versus nurture. So John Watson would say the environment you grow up in will completely determine who you are as a person. Your genetic predisposition, your nature, does not determine who you are. And here's a very famous quote from John Watson. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Excuse me. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So this is John Watson saying, in about as an extreme way as you can, that if I have this make believe world where I can control everything that that young child is exposed to, I can turn that child into anything I want them to be. And John Watson tried to do just that in an experiment. So John Watson is very famous for a study done on what we're calling Little Albert. And so John Watson, again, he's heavily focused on this idea that your environment determines everything. So he tried to think of a way he could perform an experiment to prove this. So he focused on fears, and he thought that fears are learned. Fears are not something we're born with. We have to learn to be afraid of specific things. So what he did is he took a baby, literally a baby, uh, called him Little Albert. That's not his real name. He had to protect his identity. And he put him in a room with a little bunny. And the little bunny would approach little Albert, and little Albert was fascinated with the bunny, and he would pet the bunny. And it was this wonderful little interaction between this harmless bunny and little baby Albert. So they established right off the bat that Albert is not afraid of bunnies. But then again, John Watson is this crazy psychopath, and he wants to show that fears are learned. So he wants to make little Albert afraid of that bunny. So now, in the second phase of the experiment, every time that bunny gets close to little Albert, or little Albert gets close to the bunny, a loud gong sounds in the experimental room. So every time the bunny and little Albert get close to each other, this really loud noise occurs. And wouldn't you know it, little Albert hates that loud noise. So he starts crying. So now this goes on for quite a while. And pretty soon, little Albert realizes every time that bunny gets close, that noise happens. And every time that noise happens, it scares him and he hates it and he starts crying. So little Albert's putting two and two together, and now every time that bunny gets close, he starts crying. He starts throwing a fit. He's now scared of that bunny because he knows that loud noise is going to come if that bunny gets close. So that's the experiment, and it made a lot of waves because, yes, it showed in this example, fears can be learned. Poor little Albert learned to be afraid of bunnies for no reason. This obviously brought up a lot of ethical issues. John Watson never went through the trouble of making sure little Albert was no longer afraid of bunnies. So little Albert presumably left that experiment and had a lifelong fear of bunnies. The hell, John Watson? Another issue came up here. John Watson's career was kind of derailed. He ended up having numerous affairs with research assistants in his laboratory. And this was back at a time when that was sort of career ruining, not so much anymore. But that sort of happened, and he lost all credibility. So he kind of worked, I believe he worked for some marketing companies after that. But John Watson never really took off. He's really known for this one experiment, and that's it. One more thing I want to say about little Albert. There was this research into who and what happened to little Albert many, many, many years after this experiment took place. And turns out that through some investigative journalism, little Albert unfortunately died at a young age. He died when he was about 6 years old. I forget what it was, but it was some sort of disease that took him. It was not a violent, traumatic incident or anything like that. But this was a mystery in psychology for a long time. Poor little Albert, this very famous experimental subject, possibly afraid of bunnies for the rest of his life. You know, what happened to him? Okay, moving on from Watson, we have B.F. Skinner. And anytime you think of the rock stars of psychology, you have to think of B.F. Skinner. Freud is up there, Skinner is up there. They're very, very famous individuals for making psychology what it is today. So, B.F. Skinner is in line with this idea of behaviorism. He thinks we should be focusing on observable behavior. So, B.F. Skinner takes this idea and runs with it. According to B.F. Skinner, all behavior is dependent on what happened last time that behavior occurred. Did something pleasant happen? Did something painful happen? Well, if it's pleasant, well, then that behavior is likely to occur again in that situation. Did something painful happen? Well, then that behavior is less likely to occur. So B.F. Skinner is interested in voluntary behavior. John Watson, and we'll talk about more about John Watson later on, but Watson was more interested in reflexive behavior. Skinner, on the other hand, is more interested in voluntary behavior. And I don't want to go too much into the specifics of Skinner's brand of behaviorism here, because we will talk about it later on in the course. And we also talk about Watson a little bit later on in the course. We will focus on behaviorism in our learning chapter. But I briefly want to mention this YouTube link that I have on the slide there for the pigeon guided missile. This is a very real idea that B.F. Skinner had. This was back in World War II, and this was the idea that you could guide a missile using a pigeon. And that top picture there is the apparatus that was actually used to train these pigeons. You can see you put them in that little capsule there, which would be attached to the head of a missile, and you could train the pigeon to hit its target and I guess committing suicide at the same time. I have this video linked below. It's a short video if you'd like to watch it. It's about 3 minutes long. I included it just because I find it rather fascinating that these basic principles of behaviorism could be used in such a seemingly bizarre situation. All right, moving on to the 1960s. And after behaviorism, we have what's sometimes called the cognitive revolution. So remember that behaviorism focuses on observable behavior, almost militantly so. That is all that psychology should be. And again, this really made psychology a respectable science back in the day. But again, it was based on this idea that we can't study what's in that black box of the mind. Well, in the 1960s, that idea started to change. And this happened for many reasons, but one of the big reasons was a paper that was published in 1971 by Shepard and Metzler. And this looked at what's called the mental rotation task. And we'll talk a little bit about that task on the next slide here. But what this paper did is it basically showed, at least in theory, that the black box was opened. We could look inside the black box and directly study mental processes. And we could do this through things like measuring reaction times, measuring accuracy rates, verbal responses, button presses, etc. There are many different ways that we can directly study what's going on in that black box. Okay, so the mental rotation task. Here's what they did. They showed participants pairs of three-dimensional objects, and they asked them, are these the same object? So you can kind of do this in your head, but in order to see if they're the same object, you kind of have to rotate one to see if it matches up with the other. So let's see here. Is this first? Yep. Okay, so A, they look like the same object. B, yep, also looks like the same object. And C looks different to me. C looks like two different objects. So what you're doing in your head is you're rotating one to see if it lines up with the other. And what they found, what Metzler and Shepard and Metzler, sorry about that, what they found is that the more degrees you have to rotate something to see if it matches up, the longer it takes you to respond. So what that means is you're directly measuring how fast you can rotate something in your mind. Now that's rudimentary, but that is the first step in measuring those black box processes. Again, remember Skinner, Watson, they said that doesn't matter. They said we can't look into that black box. But this task, this mental rotation task, does a good job of showing that we can look inside that black box. We can measure the speed of this mental process. We can measure the speed of how quickly we rotate things in our minds. So again, this paper isn't in and of itself all that revolutionary, but just the proof of theory is what's the revolutionary part here. That yes, we are measuring the processing within that black box using reaction times. So the cognitive psychology kind of took off at this point, and cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes, the things like that mental rotation task. So cognitive psychology, which is what I am trained in, we study processes like learning, processes like memory, processes like language, attention, etc. And we create these wonderful models, these boxes and arrow diagrams to show us sort of how these processes work. On the screen there, I have an example of a memory model. This is a very popular memory model. It's something that we'll get familiar with in the memory chapter. So you have information coming in, and that's represented by this arrow on the left here. So we're exposed to some sort of information. Let's say it's a cute girl or a cute guy's phone number. And that's certainly something we want to remember. So it immediately goes into short-term memory. And then it can go to one of two different ways there. We can forget it, or it can be put into long-term storage. And remember, this is important information. We want to remember this number. So we rehearse it. We move it back and keep it activated in short-term memory. And if it stays in short-term memory long enough because we're rehearsing it, it'll eventually get transferred into long-term memory where it'll stay, hopefully, for a long enough time before we can get somewhere and write it down or get somewhere and put it into our own phones. Now, that's one way it could go. The second way is that we don't rehearse it and it is lost forever. It leaves our short-term memory. It's displaced or decays in there, and it is not transferred to long-term memory, so we actually forget it. So in this really simple boxes and arrow diagram, we have sort of a basic understanding of this complex idea of memory, of that black box there. Okay, so that's kind of a brief history of psychology. We went from Freud and psychoanalysis, sort of almost like a mysticism flavor of psychology, to the very respectable science of behaviorism, to the opening of the black box in cognitive psychology. And from there, psychology really took off. That was kind of the impetus for creating psychology that we think of today. And today, psychology has many flavors, many tools, many uses. And psychology is one of those sciences that really permeates through pop culture. Psychology is sort of this anathema to some people, but in some ways, it sort of pervades, popular television shows, songs. It's something that a lot of people think about. And today, we have many, many, many different flavors of psychology. But the underlying commonality of all these different flavors is that they all focus on human behavior. Now, that term there, human behavior, can take many different varieties. We can talk about mental behavior, which would be like cognitive psychology, studying mental processes, the behavior that goes on in our minds. Or we can look at external behavior, which would be the realm of behaviorism, which is still around today. Looking at external behavior, how we actually physically act in the real world. Human behavior could mean healthy human behavior. How do we make ourselves healthier? Either through mental healthiness, mental health, or physical health. Or we could look at abnormal human behavior, so things like mental illnesses. We could look at isolated human behavior, how we react on our own. Or we could look at social human behavior, how we react when other people are present, or how we interact with those people, whether in small groups, big groups, one-on-one. So there's many different flavors of human behavior, but that is the underlying commonality of all the different fields in psychology. They all study human behavior in one facet or another. So, what most people think of when they think of psychology is this classic kind of therapist type of psychology. And that is a very big part of psychology. That's what we call clinical psychology. If you think of someone coming to someone for help, laying on a couch with a notepad, that is usually clinical psychology. And this is actually just a Google image search I did recently. And you can see I just typed in psychologist, clicked on images, and here we go. We've got numerous types of clinical psychology going on. I don't know if I would trust this clinical psychologist myself, but I'm not paying for it. Okay, so if you are interested, I have a link here, again, which I'll include down below this video. And if you go to the APA website, which is one of the big governing bodies of the field of psychology, you will find 54 divisions of psychology. Some examples here on this slide: cognitive, which I've mentioned; clinical, which is sort of the stereotypical type of therapy; counseling; social; biological; quantitative; evolutionary; positive, and it goes on and on and on. It's just crazy how many different kinds of psychology there are. But again, the one underlying feature here is a focus on understanding human behavior. Cognitive psychology focuses on mental behavior. Clinical psychology focuses on abnormal. So does counseling. Social behavior, how we interact with other people in groups. Biological psychology looks at, specifically what's going on in the brain with different neurotransmitters and different organs. Quantitative psychology looks at statistics. Evolutionary psychology looks at possibly the evolutionary roots or evolutionary reasons for a particular behavior to exist. And positive psychology focuses on being happy, so wellness. Now, what psychology is not? This is how I want to finish up this lecture. Psychology is not psychiatry. They are two different things. Psychiatry requires a doctorate in medicine, an MD. Psychiatrists prescribe medications. Now, there's an asterisk there. We'll come to that in just a sec. Psychiatrists ascribe to the medical model of behavior, which we'll talk about in just a sec. And psychiatrists focus exclusively on mental illness. Now contrast this with a psychologist. A psychologist has a doctorate in philosophy, which is what I have. I don't have an MD, I have a PhD. Psychologist does not prescribe medication, and that asterisk is there because that is starting to change. There are a few states now where psychologists actually can prescribe medication, but in general, that's not the case. Psychologists ascribe to many different models of behavior. They don't exclusively ascribe to the medical model of behavior. And psychologists focus on all of the different rainbow varieties of human behavior, not just mental illness. All right, so what is the medical model of behavior that psychiatrists focus on? The medical model is that all abnormal behavior has a biological cause. That's the medical model. That is what psychiatrists believe. So, what psychologists believe is that there are three main categories for causes of behavior. Biological causes, which is what the medical model solely, exclusively looks at. That is one part of a trifecta that psychologists look at. So, some biological causes for behavior could be genetic predispositions, could be temporary hormonal imbalances. But psychologists also look at psychological causes for behavior, things like learned behaviors. Did you learn that particular behavior from a peer, from a loved one, from a parent? They also look at cognition. Is there something wrong with someone's memory processing? Let's say maybe their hippocampus is damaged. Does that lead to an impairment in short-term memory? And psychologists will also look at social cultural causes of behavior. And there's a lot of different factors here. Is there peer pressure? Are there social roles, stereotypes, societal norms? What are the influences on someone's behavior coming from this category? So, whereas a psychologist would look at these three main categories to try to understand a particular behavior, a psychiatrist who's focusing only on mental illness is only going to focus on the biological cause, which in a lot of terms, or in a lot of different situations, usually means like a neurotransmitter imbalance, too much of or too little of dopamine or serotonin or something like that. So, in a nutshell, that's the big difference between psychologists and psychiatrists. Psychiatry is focused exclusively on the biological side of things. Psychologists are focused on a diverse array of causes of behavior. Some of the big questions of psychology, again, the big one there, what are the causes of behavior? Are these causes nature or nurture? Are they from our genetics, our genetic predisposition? Basically, are we born this way and we can't change it? Or are we this way because of we are a product of our environment? So that is a huge question lingering in psychology right now. Are we who we are because of our nature, or are we who we are because of our nurture? Another big question, what is the mind-body connection? How does our mind connect to our body? What is the mind? That's a strange question to ask. It's one of those things you kind of feel like you know what it is, but when you put it into words, you really struggle. What is the mind? Okay, it's this ether like thinking space that I have. Does it exist in the physical reality? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. How does it influence my actual physical behavior? Well, that is a wonderful, wonderful question. Another big question is what makes us human? Are we unique? Is there anything we do that other animals can't? And this is how I'm going to end the lecture today. I'm going to put some questions on the slide. And this has been a big question that has, I don't want to say plagued psychology, but it's been around for a long time and we've never really accurately answered it until the last couple decades. So, how do we differentiate ourselves from the other animals on this planet? What can we do that other animals can't? So, we'll skip that because that's for in-person classes. Do non-human animals have the ability to be cruel? For a long time, that was thought to be something that was uniquely human. Humans are the only animals that can engage in things like torture and war. It's kind of a dark view of humanity, but is that the thing that separates us from non-human animals? Do non-human animals have culture? For a long time, this was thought to be something that only humans had. We are the only creatures on this planet that can pass information from generation to generation. Number three, do non-human animals have the ability to count? For a long time, it was thought that mathematical ability was something uniquely human. Number four there, this again was thought to be something that only humans did for a long time, have sex for pleasure. In the vast majority of cases in the animal kingdom, sex is seen as a necessary step in reproduction. And humans might be the only critters on this planet that do it simply for the fun of it. And a last question there, language. Do non-human animals have language? And your answers. Yes, 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 no. All right, starting with number one. Do non-human animals have the ability to be cruel? And the answer is absolutely yes. And one example that I often bring up is chimpanzees. We're going to talk a lot about chimpanzees, so I might save that one. I'll instead use my cat example. Do the domesticated cats have been studied extensively for their ability to be cruel? There have been numerous instances of cats being observed simply playing with their prey, like ripping limbs off and sort of injuring to the point where the prey can't escape, but not to kill it. So that's just one example of many different ways that, well, I mean, I would certainly call that cruelty. And I know that meets a lot of different psychologists' definition of cruelty as well. Culture, yes. So we define culture in the psychological sciences as generational transmission of knowledge. So knowledge being passed from one generation to the next. A great example of this would be dolphins. There's a particular group of dolphins over in Australia that has been observed putting sea sponges on the tips of their nose and then using that sea sponge to protect their nose while they sort of dig around in groups of coral. And there was one dolphin that was first observed doing that. Pretty quickly, the rest of that group started doing it. And now it's been long enough, and researchers have been studying this pod of dolphins long enough that new dolphins are being born into this group and they're being taught to do that very thing, to put sea sponges on their nose. So there we have generational transmission of knowledge. Number 3, the ability to count. Do non-human animals have the ability to count? This one is pretty straightforward. Yes, you can ask many different species, chimpanzees, bonobos, African gray parrots, dogs even. They can show some basic arithmetic ability. Number 4, sex for pleasure. This one is an unequivocal yes. The example I like to give for this one is bonobos. Bonobos are a very, very close relative of the chimpanzee. And if you've never heard of the bonobo, there's a very good reason for that. If you go to a zoo, there's a good chance you'll see a chimpanzee. Maybe you'll see a silverback gorilla, but chimpanzees are pretty popular. The reason bonobos are not popular is because they do some pretty obscene things. There was a zoo in Germany that had a bonobo exhibit, and they actually had to put a big curtain up because the bonobos were engaging in sex for pleasure pretty much all day long. You can imagine if, let's say, like a local elementary school were visiting and all of a sudden there's just a bonobo orgy going on in their little enclosure. Well, that's not exactly something that little Susie or little Johnny should probably be seeing at the zoo. But bonobos are a wonderful instance of animals having sex for pleasure. Interesting fact, bonobos actually have a matriarchal society. So at the top of the social ladder there, they have females instead of males. So bonobos are actually a wonderful critter to study. They're in a lot of ways very similar to chimpanzees, but in a lot of ways they're kind of like their exact opposite. They tend to settle disputes through physical gratification, whereas chimpanzees will settle disputes through physical violence. Just a couple little genetic tweaks lead to these very different species. And moving on to the last one. Do non-human animals have language? This is where we've drawn the line between humans and non-human animals. Now, you might be thinking, well, what the heck? Parrots can say some pretty crazy things. There's actually been some notable examples of parrots having vocabularies in the hundreds of words. None of the examples that have been recorded so far show what we call language. I don't want to give too much away, but a lot of what we have seen in these studies so far is that these animals have basically an ability to parrot what we say. They don't have a deep understanding of what we consider to be language. And I don't want to give too much away again, so I'm not going to define language for you, but I'm kind of going to leave it at this sort of disappointing cliffhanger here, but this is where we draw that line. There has been no satisfactory study to date to show that animals have language abilities. They have communication abilities, but they don't have language abilities. This might be the single thing that is special to us, the one thing we can do that no other critter on this planet can. All right. That is all I have for you guys on this topic. Thanks for listening. Even those of you that are playing at 1.5 or 2.5 speed. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you for